Real quickly, two quick things that I sort of forgot to mention. One more risk factor that may determine whether or not she's a candidate for a TAVR valve would be the level of calcification of the valve here. Kind of the worst thing that could happen in a TAVR is if there's a ton of calcification here. Obviously, you're not taking anything that was there out. You're simply inflating that balloon inside of the device and kind of mushing the old leaflets up against the wall of the aorta. And if there's too much calcium buildup there, sometimes when there's some calcium, you'll inflate just a balloon on its own first to kind of break up that calcium, and then you'll inflate the balloon, deploy the device there. But that can be dangerous because when you're pushing that calcium up against the wall of the aorta, if there's too much of it, it could rupture the wall of the aorta. Obviously, that's a huge vessel. It would bleed really fast. And in that scenario, you would need an immediate surgical cut down and repair of the aorta itself. That's kind of worst case scenario. And if they think that there's too much calcification, I know that on the echo, it showed that there was buildup. So that's kind of the biggest risk factor, and it could be a determining factor in whether or not she's a candidate for a TAVR. The other thing I sort of failed to mention is that is how well the TAVR valves work and how long they last. Obviously, they're constructed super well. I think they guarantee them for 10 or 15 years or something like that. If in young people that have they have a bad valve from genetics and they have to get a TAVR really early in life, that getting it replaced is something that they'd have to consider. But in grandma's case, the valve would easily outlive her and she shouldn't have any problems with that. TAVR valves don't generally work or fail. I know grandma asked well, what if it doesn't work? Doesn't generally happen like that. The placement can be a little bit less ideal, but it's always going to work. The only time there's issues is sometimes it doesn't work as well as you would want it to, right? So it would have to be placed pretty poorly in order for the flow, the cardiac output or the ejection fraction, the amount of blood being pumped out of the heart, to be the same or worse. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it was the physician's fault. It could just be that some people have really difficult anatomy. Like I said, the heart is always moving. There's a whole bunch of reasons why the placement can be not ideal. But sometimes rather than getting, let's say, the 100% result that you were looking for, maybe it only works 90%, maybe it only works 80%. That's not uncommon for the results to not be, everything that they hoped that it would be, but generally it's always better than it was before. And not to say that that, I shouldn't say that that's common, but there's plenty of times where they look at it and generally what happens is that the valve always works the way you intend it, but if it's not seated properly, sometimes blood will leak around the valve. Obviously, people's aortas aren't perfect cylinders, and the valve kind of is, so you're trying to fit this perfect cylinder into this irregular aorta shape that has all this calcium buildup. And obviously they do the best they can, but you only get one shot at deploying this thing, right? Once you've crossed the valve with it and you're mushing those leaflets, you're damaging them. There's no going back at that point. They have to deploy it. And the heart is moving as they're deploying it. They can make sort of micro adjustments and move it back and forward a little bit. But, they don't want to be too far back and cover the coronary arteries. They don't want to be too far forward and risk it potentially slipping into the left ventricle. So that is the the most nerve-wracking part of the deployment. It's the most tenuous part of the procedure, and you can only make these micro adjustments, and after it's been placed, it's sort of what's done is done. You can, if it's not like well opposed, if it's not sitting firmly against the walls of the aorta, you can put that balloon back through and reinflate it one more time to try and press it like firmly up against the walls of the aorta. But it's not something that they want to do. They don't want to risk damaging the valve. So the measurements and the result would have to be pretty not ideal for them to do that. So most of the time, if they deploy it, then they double check the flow and double check the gradient, see how much they've improved that aortic stenosis, or the AS by, aortic stenosis. And they're looking for like a really low gradient. They're looking to have very little leakage, but there's generally always a little bit. And so it's not, I just wanted to clarify that it's not necessarily will it work, will it not. It's not like a thing where it's like, oh, will it take? It's generally always going to be better than it was before. It just sometimes, based on people's anatomy and the deployment, you don't get everything you're hoping for, but it's still good.